Until 1972, the Museum of Berlin exhibited, among other things, a teapot. From above it is 22 centimetres long, 13.5 centimetres wide, and 13 centimetres tall. Its chrome finish gives an oil surface ripple to the reflections of objects around it as it shifts from light to dark in a metallic gradient. This isn't the kind of teapot you've seen on elderly relatives' coffee tables, however, with their ceramic elephant trunks and floral finishes. The chrome surface and stunted, almost resentment of a spout place this teapot firmly in the sphere of modernism. Aesthetically, it is indistinct from any other early modernist piece of kitchenware. It is mass-produced, purposefully unremarkable, and entirely functional. The Bauhaus produced many similar pieces, except this teapot isn't from the Bauhaus, it predates it, and the Werkbund too. This piece from 1904 is the work of Henry van der Velde. Born in 1863, he is best known as one of the earliest practitioners of Art Nouveau. The clue to the artist's identity lies in the teapot's handle. Where the later, more anonymous work of the Bauhaus had functional and nondescript handles in keeping with its reductionism, this handle is ornate, and a work of art in itself. Rather than the bare straight lines of the Bauhaus, this handle, carved from ivory, tapers to a point in the shape of a leaf. It is at once a piece that looks forward to the incoming wave of modernism, and also back to the artistic nuances of Nouveau. The handle is not just a handle. Rather, it is an identifier of an artist for whom the stark realities of modernism were a warning of a loss of autonomy and identity. It is a symbol of the fear felt by early 20th century artists towards the disintegrated and chaotic urbanity of industrialization. And yet, what is also apparent is van der Velde's acceptance of the industrial as a tool for synthesis, in which beauty and artistic individuality need not be sacrificed to the machine, nor the machine sacrificed for artistic integrity. In one small, ostensibly inconsequential piece, we can see at once the inexorable development of the modernist aesthetic and the final, gasping resistance of the artistic autonomy before it surrendered to industrial reduction. It is no coincidence that Henry van der Velde's work of the early 1900s bears a striking resemblance to the work of the Bauhaus 2 decades later. Van der Velde is intrinsically linked to the development of modernism, and is arguably the originator of the aesthetic the Bauhaus adopted soon after its founding. In an artistic landscape still at the mercy of Morris and Ruskin, van der Velde realised that rejecting the machine was a mistake. It limited art both aesthetically and economically. In mass production, van der Velde saw not an obstacle, but a way in which to make art and beauty accessible to all, rich or poor. It was a romantic notion, and in an era in which many of the old ways were falling out of favour, especially in Germany, there was little room for romance. Now, when we discuss the beginning of modernism, Henry van der Velde is rarely a name that appears in anything but the periphery. Despite being a founder of Art Nouveau, a founding member of the Deutsche Werkbund, director of the Grand Ducal School of Arts and Crafts in Weimar, and an eminent architect in Europe through much of the first half of the 20th century. Henry van der Velde is the progenitor of the modernist style, and yet we do not remember his name or afford him the kind of credit we allow the canonical fathers of modernism. Art Nouveau has its roots in the arts and crafts movement. Inspired by natural forms and structures, particularly the curved lines of flowers, it was a reaction to the rigid and academic art of the 19th century. Henry van der Velde found some refuge for his ideals in arts and crafts, but in accepting the value of mass production, he positioned himself at odds with its founding tenets. In many ways, Art Nouveau was an ineffectual movement. It was neither capable of making great changes in the artistic landscape, nor of moving those that appreciated it. Theodor Adorno suggested that its lie was the beautification of life without its transformation. Beauty itself thereby becomes vacuous and, like all abstract negation, allowed itself to be integrated into what it negated. Beauty for beauty's sake, and this could not move van der Velde sufficiently, so after years as an artist, he decided to pursue the applied arts, motivated by the aspiration to apply art to life. In 1907, artists including van der Velde, Adolf Loos, Hermann Muthesius and Peter Behrens founded the Deutsche Werkbund. Its aim was to bring art and industry together and, in so doing, push Germany forward and away from the traditional trappings that many felt were holding it back. Yet, while the members of the Werkbund all accepted the role industry would play in art, for some time they were uncertain exactly how to use it. In this confusion, van der Velde found both allies and adversaries to his ideals. In the power of mass production, he saw a potential to uphold the virtues of arts and crafts, while rejecting the exclusivity of the movement and providing affordable and repeatable quality products to the masses. The grounds for his opposition to the growing momentum of standardization were artistic, not moral. He had no problem with the idea of a reiterating model, but that model needed a soul. In 1849, Wagner had proposed a unification of art as a revolutionary opposition to the capitalist division of labour. Van der Velde, however, proposed his total work of art almost as a compromise to the hard lines of standardised modernism. It was a resistance of sorts, but also seen as an opportunity to provide a therapy to anxiety-driven consumerism of industrialisation with the redemptive powers of art and beauty. But for the growing voice of standardisation, nothing less than a complete rejection of the arts and crafts and adoption of a set paradigm would do. As a result, Henry van der Velde found himself at odds with the establishment, which led to his and the Werkbund's greatest conflicts. At a 1914 meeting, the debates and contradictions that plagued the organisation came to a head. On one side was Henry van der Velde and the supporters of artistic autonomy, on the other Hermann Matthesius and those who felt that standardisation was the only way forward. The debate was a turning point for modernism, paving the way for a set of standards to be developed that would govern modernism for decades. To hear van der Velde tell it, it was a monumental struggle that saw thunder and lightning sounding outside as he demanded the rights to free, independent, creative work. Whether van der Velde's rather dramatic account, written in his 90s, can be relied upon is uncertain. However, there is no doubt that the result of the debate sent shockwaves through the burgeoning modernist movement. Standardisation's victory saw the movement shift from a confused mix of concepts to the more familiar reductionist movement we know today. For van der Velde, the loss of autonomy was a cruel blow, an offence even. The idea of soulless art was one he could not countenance. Art was a living, breathing thing created by living and breathing human beings. As Aldo Rossi echoed, it does not make much sense to talk about the interior and exterior of a building because the entire construction is determined by a single synthetic conception. Through floors and spaces, the conception of the house becomes a concept of life. That is what modernism meant to van der Velde, not the machine for living in ethos that would be practiced at the Bauhaus. Henry van der Velde's defeat in 1914 stayed with him. After leaving Germany in 1917, he moved to Switzerland and then back to his native Belgium. There he resurfaced in the 1930s as Belgium's eminent architect and designer. While his work abroad spoke of a movement to come, the Werkbund Theatre and in particular the Kröller-Müller Museum, it is with structures in Brussels that Henry van der Velde demonstrated his true prowess. Rather than the grey tombstones of the Bauhaus, van der Velde created buildings as much at home on the skyline pierced by church steeples as they were beside the most modern skyscraper. How then can a man whose work preempted the aesthetic of modern art and design, and who played a major part in laying the foundations for its development, be so nameless in the history of modernism? In truth, Henry van der Velde found himself too often on the losing side. Progressive though his views may have been, he was also keen to uphold many traditions that just didn't fit into the artistic landscape of pre-war Germany. The old, cliched adage rings true: history is written by the victor. Matthesius' standardisation won out, and van der Velde's unwillingness to drop the mantle of artistic individuality proved a major factor in his undoing. And yet, he also suffered for not being German in an increasingly nationalistic Germany. Throughout his career, he was referred to as the Belgian van der Velde, and though he had founded the Grand Ducal School, the Grand Duke of Weimar made no secret of his distaste for a non-German running his college. Had van der Velde not been forced to leave Germany at the outbreak of the First World War, there was little doubt he would have been replaced as director of the school by a German native. As nationalism erupted around the country, the contributions of the Belgian were downplayed, not least by Walter Gropius, his successor. Gropius made a concerted effort to de-emphasise Henry van der Velde's achievements and assert his own position at the Bauhaus exhibition of 1923. But in speaking of the total work of art and an orchestral unity being inherently related to architecture, he succeeded only in echoing van der Velde's own treatment of the modernist question. Then there was van der Velde's record in the Second World War, and the perception, albeit spread by resentful colleagues, that when, like many of his compatriots, he was obliged to help the occupying Germans, he was, in fact, collaborating. Unfounded as it was, the allegation stayed with him, until he retired to Switzerland after the war to write his memoirs. Yet it was there, an expatriate once again, that Henry van der Velde died in 1957. Perhaps our purpose is not to exalt Henry van der Velde above others as father and inventor. After all, there are many contradictions in Henry van der Velde: the artist, industrialist and socialist, arts and crafts and the Werkbund, the individualist and the mass producer, the Belgian painter and the German architect. Ostensibly these appear paradoxical, but this is a view afforded by hindsight. In looking at the context of all these things, we can see an intrinsic link between them, progression from one to the other, in which Van der Velde played a major part. Despite attempts to limit his involvement in retrospect, Van der Velde's name looms large over the passage of modernism, so perhaps our purpose is to highlight those that were never sanctified by the international style in the way Gropius, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe and Frank Lloyd Wright were. Henry van der Velde, and arguably Adolf Loos and Peter Berens with him, represent a vital but forgotten part of modernism. They're not wholly lost to history, but are rarely given their proper due. They are the masters of masters, whose tutelage laid the groundwork for modernism's canonical fathers to flourish. Their work was no less revolutionary or innovative, but it came in a period of confusion, where the rules of the game had not yet been established. But there is an illegibility to Henry van der Velde's credo that hindered him, and much as he was never German, he was never entirely modernist either. Be it nationalism, individualism, or his place of birth, a great deal has worked to wipe van der Velde from the history of modernism. But really, even his own work conspired against him. Where other designers are remembered for their stylistic signatures, van der Velde's aesthetic is so replicated, so influential, that it is now indistinguishable from the rest of the modern landscape. It is a testament to his lasting influence that his designs of the modernist period are so familiar today, and though he has disappeared into the fabric of our daily lives, for those who know where to look, there remain signs of van der Velde's particular artistic voice. A handle, a leg, the curve of a gable, subtle shades of Art Nouveau that serve as clues to his great contribution and that have endured long after his name has been forgotten.